This is our third lecture in the Ecology lecture series on human impact. So human impact on ecosystems is pretty far-reaching. We're going to talk about a number of them in class. Some of the big ones we're going to cover are eutrophication, global climate change, and bioaccumulation. We'll also look, though, at declining biodiversity. So the one thing I wanted to go over before you get into class is just a reiteration of how eutrophication works. So the process involved. You should have had this in lab, but I want to make sure that you're good to go for the wrap and for lecture and activities. So this is my water line, if you're curious what that is. And what we're talking about is the addition of nutrients. Nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and depending upon whether it's a freshwater or whether it's a saltwater system, certain nutrients encourage growth more than others. Now, for eutrophication, what happens is that at the surface, there typically are really high oxygen levels, and that's because nutrient inputs into an aquatic ecosystem can cause algae blooms. All right? So this is phytoplankton. You can have phytoplankton blooms from this, and they're photosynthesizers, so they live in the photic zone, right? So they've got to live where sunlight penetrates into the water, and in that zone, oxygen tends to be high, of course, because they're photosynthesizing. They're taking up CO2, and they're producing oxygen. But you might say, well, what's the big deal there? That's great. So we're encouraging plant growth. That even can sequester CO2. That would be a sink for CO2, which would be a good thing. But there's a flip side to this. One, you can have overpopulation of certain species of algae, and the problem with that is that it excludes other species. So like with your duckweed example, you can decrease biodiversity in the area by having a mat of duckweed. So that's a negative. The other negative is that the zooplankton in the water, so let's just maybe draw little X's for zooplankton. Those would be the little herbivorous plankton that would consume these guys, and they just can't do an adequate job. There's so many phytoplankton that the zooplankton can't eat them all. So what happens is that they sink and they die. Okay, so they sink and drop when they die, and this would be the substrate at the bottom of our either saltwater system or freshwater system. And what happens here is microbes in the soil go ahead and they use up oxygen to metabolize, to consume and metabolize these phytoplankton, dead phytoplankton. So oxygen is high at the surface because phytoplankton are producing oxygen, but when they drop and they die, the bacteria are directly responsible for decreasing O2. And this can lead to anoxic zones, right? So dead zones that you've heard about. Your TA probably talked about it in lab. So oxygen is greatly reduced, which is obviously really, really bad for ecosystems. So I'll give you a real live example of that when we get into class. And then we'll talk about global climate change, and we'll talk about bioaccumulation and dwindling biodiversity.